So the fabric of zoodemocracy, I will later explain exactly what's my argument, but just to first kind of give you a hint to situate what I'm about to do. So what I will present today. So if you think about our everyday lives, our human everyday lives, we do all sorts of activities that in a way contribute to sustaining, to maintaining, if you like, the socio-political fabric of our communities. So we cooperate with each other, we help our neighbors, we comply with social norms, we solve conflicts, and many other things, right? And it is by doing all those things together that our democratic communities can be sustained, can be held together, as it were, that sort of thing. So when I went to Vine, I began to realize that animals did a lot of these things themselves, or so I thought. And I wanted to find a concept to grasp that. And that's what this notion of the fabric of zoodemocracy is. And my hope is that what I will do today is to provide ethnographic data and as well normative arguments to advance or to substantiate that animals can sustain this kind of, if you like, zoodemocratic fabric or socio-political fabric, right? That's what I'm going to do, but later I will give a much more specific kind of, I will situate my intervention in a more specific way later on. And so the structure is going to be basically to explain first the debates that I'm kind of, who are my interlocutors, what debates are happening in these fields of the political turn in animal rights theory, and also what has come to be known as the systemic turn in democratic theory. Those are the two primary fields that I draw on. Then a bit about the methodology, the kind of fieldwork I conducted at Vine, and finally the concept of the fabric. So the systemic turn in democratic theory, right? So the first thing that I wanted to say is that democratic theorists, until the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, they had focused on trying to, in a way, measure the quality of our democracies by analyzing specific institutions and processes. For instance, let's say that in a country X, right, they have to decide who is the next Supreme Court judge. And then one can analyze, is this process democratic enough? Is it just? Do we have good and fair mechanisms of accountability and so on? And one can focus on exclusively this thing, right? Are our elections being conducted in a way that everyone can truly participate in the next elections or something? And one focuses on that. How do we get the elections to be as democratic as possible? Things of the sort. So they focused on one kind of thing. Now, the systemic turn and Jane Mansbridge was crucial for this new turn, suggests that that's not enough to measure the quality of our democracy. So when we have to, if you like, rank a democracy, is it really good? Are our democracies very good, or are they failing in some respects? They said we also need to focus and study the interactions between different institutions, individuals, courts, advocacy organizations, and so on. There is a second aspect, that is that instead of thinking that political judgments are kind of situated in a government or a parliament or wherever, we need to begin to understand, in order to measure whether democracy is just and it's of good quality, we need to also study how the labor of making political judgments is divided and whether political institutions are taking up those political judgments. So this may sound very abstract, all of it, but with an example, I think it's going to become clear. So let's say when there was COVID in the UK, the government decided that they wanted to, the policy was going to involve getting herd immunity. They thought that, and they had evidence that this was the right course of action, the best course of action. And so when many countries in Europe were closing public spaces like restaurants, schools, and so on, in the UK, things kept going as usual, right? People kept going to school, pubs were open, etc., right? There was no curfews, nothing like that. Now, let's assume that advocacy organizations for the elderly then went protested for this. Let's assume that they began to protest because they then said, wait, hang on a second, government, we are particularly vulnerable to be harmed if our health system collapses. Therefore, this course of action is going to be very harmful for us. Please do not, well, not please, don't do that, right? Let's assume now, for the sake of the discussion, that the government had not taken this into account as much as they should, or not at all, right? Now, what we see here is that there is a certain, these advocacy organizations for the elderly, they are making a political judgment. The labor of making the political judgments is being divided because there are so many things to consider that only one body cannot do that. And so when we have to measure whether democracy is good or not, we need to kind of try to understand how there is an interaction between these organizations for the elderly and the government and all political institutions generally, right? So democratic theories began to think, hang on, we need to look at how these interactions are happening, how the labor of making political judgments are divided, and how all these things work together in tandem to kind of have great democracies, right? Or whether we are failing in this through these interactions or not, we don't have the appropriate mechanisms to kind of take up the interaction part. I hope that makes sense more or less. So I say this because my project is situated within the systemic turn and assumes this kind of understanding of democracy. You will see why, perhaps later you will see why this matters. Then the second space is the political turn in animal rights theory, which in a way, it began to happen since Zoopolis, I think. Zoopolis kind of single-handedly changed the field and opened up a new set of political questions. So at the beginning in animal rights theory, if one thinks about it, all the focus was on the moral status of animals. If we think about Peter Singer, Tom Regan, Gary Francione, all these authors were focusing primarily, if not exclusively, on what do we owe to animals as opposed to political questions. So in this new political turn, what all authors working in this field share is that they are trying to study how to construct more just political institutions and processes for human and non-human animals alike. And it is very complicated, how to position different authors, how to read the field. But I think we can, at the very least, for the sake of this talk, divide this political turn into two groups, two set of authors. So one understands that animal politics is about the aggregation of the interests of animals, right? So the idea is that animals have interests, for example, in not suffering, in being happy, and then it is our political institutions, for them to be just political institutions, they need to take this interest, the interests of animals, into account in policy-making processes, right? That's the basic idea. I suppose many of you will be familiar with this. Then the second kind of group, that is by the way, in this first group, I think that perhaps major or most famous author is Alasdair Cochrane, who has written extensively about this in Sentient in Politics and other books, Animal Rights Without Liberation as well, and other of his work. And then the second kind of group that comes more from, if you like, Pseudonoson and Wilkimnica in Zoopolis, but also Eva Meyer, Charlotte Bladner, and others. They argue that animal politics is it's much more than the aggregation of animals' interests. Democracy is all about deliberation. And even though animals do not have human speech, they can, through their bodies, say many things that should be taken up by our political institutions, so that they can participate in some way in policy making, in our poleis, right? The second group endorses the systemic approach to democratic politics. And that's more or less how these two are divided. So in a way, the first group, to summarize maybe, we could say the first group focuses on considering the interests of animals in decision-making, in political decision-making processes. Our political institutions should take that into account. As Cochrane even suggests that there should be certain dedicated animal representatives that consider these interests. The second group, if you like, focuses more on animals' voices and the ability to say things that should co-author the laws that govern us all. And that's more or less how the division is going on. And my work is situated once again in the second group. So zoopolis, which my work endorses, has, if you like, and this is going to matter a lot for what I will explain later, there are maybe two aspects that are going to matter a lot for my talk today. So one is that if the first group I mentioned earlier, they advocate for a cosmopolitan world order, right? If you like, a boundless model of democratic politics, where what matters is the all-affected interest principle, to consider the interests and how policies are going to affect the interests of different people, regardless of where they are located, focuses on how individuals may be affected by policies all over the world. The bounding model of democratic politics puts a huge weight on the notions like community, relationships. It's much more like local, gives a lot of weight to deliberation, the interactions between the citizens, and so on. And so Donaldson and Kimlicka in their book Zoopolis, they argue that domesticated animals should be seen as community members because they have made a life of their own, really, in where they live. They work. Think about service dogs and horses, oxen, many animals, right? They provide emotional support. We don't realize, but animals comply. We don't realize, often people don't realize that animals comply with all sorts of social norms when in our mixed communities. I don't know if you've noticed it, but just try to think about when you go access somewhere with your dogs, if any of you have dogs, that they may wait for you to go first or for someone to go out. All that is shaped by social norms. We will see later. I will give examples of this later in the talk. So in a way, all of they of course, they have resided in certain locations for a long time. They help other animals, including humans, right? So in a way, Donaldson and Kimlicka say domesticated animals, when one looks at the literature on citizenship, they kind of fulfill all the requirements for citizenship. If one just applies citizenship theory to the case of domesticated animals, they just fulfill all the requirements, or at least they want to argue that they do. And so they say our system is simply a tyranny. It's tyrannical because we have here de facto community members who are not legally recognized as such. On the contrary, they have property status. We can exploit them. They have no say whatsoever on the laws that govern them and the policies that govern them. And therefore, they claim this is exactly what the definition of tyranny, right? So that's the argument they make in Zoopolis, and I also endorse it. So that's that. And of course, there are contestants. There are people who disagree with this. Because for today's talk is not that important and we don't have as much time as I thought, I will skip Martha Nussbaum's teleological account of animals. I think I can skip that and it will not affect my talk. But I do want to mention not so much the political agency part of the critique of Donaldson and Kimlicka's work, but the co-authorship of laws, that I think it will interest this audience. I know Thomas wanted me to talk about these things. And that's something that Donaldson and Kimlicka have been challenged on these grounds. And the reason is this. So Donaldson and Kimlicka claim, and everyone agrees on this actually, that citizenship involves having a right to co-author the laws that govern us all. And Donaldson and Kimlicka argue in Zoopolis that animals can't do that. But the way they make this argument has been challenged by people like Angie Pepper, Christopher Hinchcliffe, also, again, Alasdair Cochrane, and other authors. So they say in Zoopolis, among other things, but one of the things they say is that the sheer presence of animals in public spaces can ignite political change. And that sheer presence alone should be read as the co-authorship of the laws. Ansi Pepa, and in my view correctly, has responded to this, that it leaves us with a conception of co-authorship and political action as well, that does not enable us to differentiate between the mere expression of preference and, if you like, meaningful co-authorship of the laws. And she gives an illuminating example that I think it's fantastic. She says, if we take the previous example of COVID and organizations for the elderly and just many people going to protest, right? And then Pepa says, if then there is a person who goes to buy a hat, this person is going to buy a hat, but is dragged into the protest. In other words, the person ends up being in the protest accidentally, not necessarily because this person agrees with the aims of the protest. The person is just there by chance. She says, according to Donaldson and Kimlicka's conception of co-authorship and political action, we should read that as a political action, as if the person was supporting the protest because the person was simply there just by chance. And Pepa says this is a problem. We need to be able to differentiate between a person that supports the protest willingly and really wants to change these policies related to COVID and so on, and the person who is there by accident. So then Pepa recurs and goes back to a more, if you like, traditional conception of political action and co-authorship of the laws that involves having certain rational capacities that allow one to have a concept of the law, and understand, in this case, the aims of the protest, and then when a person goes to a protest willingly, and when a person intentionally tries to affect political institutions, then is when we can say that that person is co-authoring the laws, that that person is acting politically. Now, the response that Donaldson and Kimlicka have given to these two things, the theological account of animals and the co-authorship, and I think, even though I've not explained Nussbaum, it's worth explaining briefly the response because it matters then for why I went to Vine. So they say that domesticated animals' capacities are not fixed to their species. So they put a lot of weight, and this is partly influenced by the idea that they focus on a bounded model of democratic politics. They give a lot of weight to processes of socialization, in which animals, when one sees how animals' subjectivity and how the communities are then shaped and what they can do, what kind of actions they can do, what kind of norms they can comply with, that a lot of these things don't depend on the capacities that they have by virtue of belonging to this or that species. It depends on processes of socialization. And so they say domesticated animals' capacities are not fixed to their species. They hang a lot on whether their agencies are enabled or suppressed, whether they are socialized in environments that are healthy or not, whether they interact with these or those species or not, so on. So that's one thing. But the other thing that matters for what I will say later about what co-authorship means is that this group of authors in the second point, if you like, they often think of agency as being quite individualistic. It hangs on whether one can make rational judgments, think rationally, and act accordingly. But Donaldson and Kimlicka say there is a literature in disability studies and feminist philosophy that has challenged this view of agency and argues that agency is instead distributed. So if one thinks, for example, about resistance and protest, whether a person's actions are read as political or as requiring of co-authoring the laws or changing our policies will depend on whether others take that up or not. So it's not simply that a person rationally makes a judgment and then that's already a political action. That hangs on whether others recognize the action as a political action, as, say, resistance, and we could give many examples of that. Again, this may sound abstract, but because we don't have a lot of time, I prefer to just move on. And then when we see the examples and what the animals actually do, I think this will make more sense, perhaps. But the thing I want to say before I continue, because you people may be able to help me in the Q&A, is that when I wrote my article, because the article on the Fabric of Zoodemocracy that today's talk is there's an article version of this that is now under review, and they are working on I sent the revisions. One of the things that they were worried, the reviewers, was how I was conceptualizing the co-authorship of laws. They said, you still don't let us distinguish between co-authorship and the mere expression of a preference. So I tried to sort that out and fix that. But if at the end of the talk you are not convinced, I have not told you that how I try to solve that problem. But if at the end you think, oh, Pablo has done a great job with this, excellent, then let me know. If not, also tell me, we are not convinced that this is co-authorship. We are not convinced that we can differentiate between what you are saying, what we are calling co-authorship, and simply the expression of a preference. Like, I like chocolate, as opposed to this is something that political institutions should care about, right? The expression of a preference. A government should not take up whether I like chocolate or I like bananas. However, there are other things, say the organizations for the elderly protesting for COVID, that a government should listen to that and take up, right? So that's what is at stake in this debate. So that's that. And then the methodology, very briefly. So Vine Sanctuary, as Thomas said, is in Vermont in the US, in Springfield. It's an LGBTQ plus led sanctuary. It was founded by Miriam Jones and Patrice Jones, who are both feminist writers. And there are many species of animals living at Vine. There are pigs, goats, alpacas, emus, cows, geese, ducks, chicken, lots of different species of animals living together. And the reason why I chose Vine is because, as I perhaps I don't know if I explained this, but one of my primary aims when I went to Vine was to study the kinds of political dynamics that were unfolding at that in that kind of community, right? We have very few studies of this kind, especially in contexts where there are different species doing this. Vine is, in some respects at least, a kind of prefigurative space where we can sort of test whether a zoopolis would be possible. So it's the perfect place to conduct this kind of research, to test the ideas in zoopolis. So that's one of the reasons I chose Vine as well. And also the other thing that was crucial is that the people running Vine, they understand that animals have a moral right to self-determination. They understand that the sanctuary is the animal's home. And so one of the first things that Patrice Jones told me was, just to give you an example, that I could not interact with animals unless they approach me first. I should not touch them. She told me, don't worry that some of them will just come to you and be very welcoming and really want to groom with you, interact with you in some ways. That's then totally fine. But those animals who do not want to interact with you, then the by default position is don't leave them alone, because this is their home. We should not touch those who do not want to be touched, simply, right? So that was very important for me, because I was trying to study what kind of, if there are conflicts, how do animals themselves solve conflicts? If animals can co-author social norms, how do they do that? And what kinds of social norms are they co-authoring? And so on. That was the aim. So that's why I chose Vine. I spent a couple of months at Vine conducting a multispecies ethnography, specifically participant observation, which involved working at the sanctuary, observing the animals, interacting with those animals that wanted to interact with me. I also tried to send animals. Those are all the fields that influence me. And that is quite important if one adopts a zoopolitical kind of reading. Because the idea is that animals themselves should author what we write. But I will not talk about that because I don't have a lot of time. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that animal agency in community was a very important point of reference for me. It's an article written by Charlotte Blarna, Ryan Wilcox, and Sue Donaldson. So then we go to the fabric finally. And here I want to first mention at the level of the concept of the fabric that this concept has, if you like, two sides to it. One is that there are different elements that I discuss in tandem and that I was in a way forced by the ethnographic work to conceptualize this in tandem. So if you think, for example, about something like cooperation, right? So when one of the things that geese do is to be all the time they will restrain other community members who may, when they fight perhaps in a too harsh way and they think there is some kind of danger. So then they will restrain them. And they will do this first by honking. If things get a bit out of hand, they may then separate them physically by putting themselves in the middle or grabbing someone from a wing. And they do this cooperatively. They are responsive to what the other goose, if there are two geese, let's assume, solving a conflict, they will be responsive to what the other goose is doing. They also have the ability to understand to what extent that it's severe, this interaction. Also, those involved in this conflict, they will see the geese as mediators. So the point is that only in this act of cooperation, there is responsibility, communication, solving a conflict. All this is involved in one action of cooperation. So that the fabric is in part that certain elements that are required to sustain a community will often appear at once in one action. And the other aspect is that and this aligns with the systemic turn in democratic theory. So the idea is that for a community to just work as a social and as a political community, there are many things that need to be happening all over the place in terms of complying with social norms, solving conflicts, negotiating a space, communicating, being responsive to each other. And so all those things need to together occur to sustain and to hold our communities together. So those are the kind of two aspects of the fabric. And then the last thing that I want to say about the argument is this, that my argument is not going to be, because sometimes this is confused, is not going to be that domesticated animals author or can co-author a fabric of a zoodemocratic system per se, but rather that they act in those ways that are required to sustain the fabric of a zoodemocracy. This means that if and when humans decided to recognize animals as citizens, animals would be able to sustain the zoodemocratic fabric of that system. I hope that makes sense. So the first element I want to discuss, there will be three elements. And the first one is these capacities for mutuality and norm compliance, right? And this refers, Donaldson and Wilkimik in an article of them in 2015, they say that sharing a socio-political life presupposes certain capacities for mutuality, which include the possibility and desire for physical proximity, communication, trust, responsive interaction, and cooperation. In the geese example I said before, there are already quite a few of those. But I think the case of Marble and Pumpernickel it really illuminates this and illustrates what this is all about. So Marble and Pumpernickel, they were two goats that arrived to Vine in 2022. This is Pumpernickel. And so when they arrived to Vine, for that first year, I conducted fieldwork in 2022 in October and in December. And already the human workers told me they seem to be very shy. They have not integrated in the community. They always, I noticed they were always sitting from the outer ring as opposed to what they call the inner ring. When they did this hay ring that cows, sheep, and goats and alpacas, sometimes the pig, they eat frequently together from this hay ring. And they noticed that Marble and Pumpernickel, they wouldn't always be here in this outer ring, while the hay in the inner ring is what the animals prefer because it's drier, it's nicer, they like it more. And I believe that it's very plausible that the reason why they did this is simply because they were being, not exactly this, but let's say expelled, as it were, from the inner ring. And I identified at least two reasons. One is that it was quite odd that they would always try to eat from exactly the same point that the other person was. So say that Pumpernickel wanted to eat from the hay ring, from the inner ring, right? So instead of going, say, to here, this spot that seems free, Pumpernickel would go exactly, this is Church, this goat here, exactly where Church's head is. So he would get quite annoyed and would headbutt Pumpernickel because Church would be like, there is a kind of norm that this is my space. I want to have some space for myself and eat, to eat, in peace, as it were. So that was one behavior that I found slightly odd. The other one was that both Marble and Pumpernickel would often position themselves behind a goat like this. And they would simply stay there for sometimes more than 1 minute. You know, when someone is looking from you from the back, that you sense someone is looking at me, and then you turn around and you may see someone looking at you, right? I'm sure many of you have had this experience. So the goats and the sheep and the cows also had this experience when Marble and Pumpernickel acted like that. And then even before, when they would see them, they would just chase them out and say, why are you doing that? Leave us alone, right? So I observed these two behaviors that were quite odd. And it's understandable because Marble and Pumpernickel were raised by humans. They were pet goats. And that means then that, yes, that they had never been socialized. They had never got to learn how one behaves with other community members. However, in 2023, when I did my fieldwork again, they seemed like two more non-human residents. They were acting like anyone else. They were eating from the hair ring, from the inner ring. They were not being headbutted by anyone or chased away anymore. They were just completely integrated. They seemed like anybody else. I also noticed they had begun to play, which I had not observed in my previous fieldwork. And so I believe what happened here with this headbutting, which is how goats and sheep and the cows communicate amongst each other. What happened was a process of socialization. They learned how they should approach the hearing, that it was not appropriate to be behind someone staring at them. And they also began to comply with the norms of the community. And they were beginning to be seen by the other community members as one of us, right? As community members. And the playing, I think, evinces this as well. So here we see then the capacity to comply with social norms, the importance of socialization, how species boundaries are being broken, and who teaches whom, because it was goats, sheep, and cows who were teaching Marble and Pumpernickel how things are done at Vine, what are the norms that are kind of shaping the community. So that's the first kind of aspect of the fabric. The second one is, and this is really important in a democracy, right? In any political community, in a way, is to manage difference and disagreements. There are always disagreements. There are always conflicts, and we need to find ways to solve them and get over them. So the example I'm going to give is this about these two gray roosters there that you see in the picture. So one morning I was observing this territory here. The human workers suggested me to go there because there is a lot of things happening in this particular space. There is a pond, and there is here a coop, and they said, oh, that's a good place to observe how the birds interact with each other. So I was just there observing, and nothing particularly weird happened, like things seemed to be fine. And the animals were eating around, and that was all seemed good. I stayed there for about 2-3 hours. But the next day, these gray roosters began to chase me every time they saw me. They would try to hit at me with the claws and with their beaks as well. So what I did is always just to withdraw. I didn't want to cause any conflicts or make them feel uncomfortable. But of course, this was a problem for my fieldwork. I was also participating in the community. And it turned out, when I talked with Cheryl Wiley about this, that these two roosters in particular were particularly nasty. There are animals that are very nice, and there are animals that are not so nice, as it happens with humans. They have their own personalities and mankind of all kinds. So these two roosters were not particularly nice, and I asked Cheryl, oh, how can we solve this? What do you do if you ever, because this also happened to the workers at Vine. So she said, oh, what we do here at Vine when this happens to us, because they just need to be able to work around, feed the animals, do all the things that they need to do, is they kind of, if you do like these two animals with your hands, right, they get scared and then they kind of leave you alone. So don't grab them, Wiley told me, but do this action and then they will leave you alone. I thought, okay, I will do as you suggest. So I did that one day. But this didn't work at all. So the roosters one of them especially got very angry, and this one began jumping at me with the claws, trying to attack me, sort of thing. And then because that's how I deal with conflicts in a way, I just ran away, not ran away, but walked backwards and positioned myself inside an area that was a snowed area, right? So it had snow. I knew that chicken dislike snow a lot, so they don't like to step on it. So I positioned myself inside this snowed area, and the gray rooster stayed outside. And then, to my surprise, about 3-4 minutes later, 2 white roosters came from quite a long distance. We had walked quite a bit of distance, and they positioned themselves between the gray rooster and I, exactly between us. And then immediately after that, the gray rooster began to relax, began to peck on the floor again, which is what they often do, and went back to his territory that is in front of this yellow coop that we saw in the previous picture. So I think what we see here is clearly that these white roosters knew that there was some kind of conflict between us. They solved this conflict. They deliberately positioned themselves between us. They enabled the agency of both of us. Remember this distributed account of agency I was mentioning earlier. So our ability to just walk around freely at the sanctuary, depending on the white roosters solving this conflict, and they did that. Importantly, the gray rooster was responsive to the white roosters as well. He saw them as beings who could tell him, it's enough, let's go, right? And there is a way for them to, so, and also, of course, this involved the compliance with certain norms of the community, that with some conflicts at some point, it's very important to just let things go and get over it, as it were. So I think here we see how one instance or one conflict was solved by the animals themselves and not by the humans, how the agency was enabled, how these disagreements or these problems were solved. And then the last thing I want to say is about protest resistance, which Chrisman and Hubbs define as follows. So they say that in any instance in which there is a protest, and there seems to be consensus in the literature about this, there are 3 interconnected aspects. The first is that political protesters will always involve some kind of critical evaluation of a policy, a law, a decision, certain actions that they will conclude is wrong, right? Protesters think there's something wrong about this. The second thing is that there is a connected prescription. For example, as we saw with the COVID case, a plea to change the government's policy in relation to the restriction of people going to public spaces, closing them, and so on. So there's a connected prescription. First, we identify something is wrong. Then there's something we want to be changed. And the third is that there is often a target audience, if not always, right? So in this case, with the COVID case, it was the government. The protesters were saying to the government, hey, we want this to be changed, the policies in relation to COVID. So I think I saw an instance, at least this case, that it fulfills that the 3 things that Chrisman and Hubbs say. Everyone in the literature agrees. These 3 aspects are always present when there is a protest. I think I observed this as well, myself at Vine. So this is Ozzy here on the left, and this is Rose. So the sanctuary is divided between what we call the commons, which is this area here, where you see the white barn and so on, where here all the animals from different species, they live there. But then here there is another space that we call the back pasture, where there are about 35 cows. It's only a kind of herd of rewilded kind of cows. And so Ozzy, he lived for quite a while in the commons. He was a cow who had been brought up as a pet, and then he didn't know how to control himself very well. So he had been put in the commons to learn how to cow, as they say at Vine. But both Rose and another cow who sadly passed away, Autumn, they were both quite old, and they didn't get to teach Ozzy how to behave and how to restrain himself. So the point is that he would headbutt quite harshly some of the goats and the sheep. Sometimes, I never witnessed this, but sometimes it happened. So they decided to send Ozzy to the back pasture for safety reasons, right? But Ozzy, it seems that he was very unhappy there. The cows at the back pasture didn't treat him very well. They would headbutt him quite harshly because he didn't know how to interact with them. And so he was always at the gate, day after day, some days mooing insistently. And sometimes mooing by looking at me when I was observing them. You can see here in this picture how he was looking at me, but often I would be on the other side of the fence.
I was here on, if you like, in the back pasture when I was at the commons, and he was moving, he will sometimes stare at me. So bear in mind that, of course, Ozzy was not at any random place of the fence. This fence, you cannot see it in the pictures, but its soul is really, really long. You know, a mile long or 1 kilometer long or something like that. And he would go to the fence, to the gate, because he knows that the fence signifies something like exit entry. We also see that with our dog companions, that sometimes they would scratch a door at home or something saying, open the door, I want to leave. So we can see that Ozzy fulfills the first premise of, or the first item for protest. There is a kind of evaluation. I am worse off at the back pasture or at this, in this new territory. I don't get along with anybody here. I don't want to be here. I want to go back. So that's the connective prescription. I am worse off here. I want to go back to where I was before. Something like that, at least. Not with these words exactly, of course. I'm just trying to communicate it, but I hope that you can follow me. And there is also target audience. He knows that we humans have the ability to open the gate and let him pass. That's why he will often stare at me, right? So I think we just should read this as a protest, and that we should read this action if we were in a kind of zoopolitical system. This is the kind of action that should be taken up by our political institutions and shape the law that governs human and non-human animals. And why? Why should all these actions be taken up by our political institutions? So I cannot give a criterion here. I think we need to go on a case-by-case basis, at least for now. I don't have a criterion. I can think of some things, but I have not systematized one. But I believe I can provide reasons why we should take up all these specific actions, why our political institutions should be shaped in such a way that happen. And the reasons are these. First, because his actions respond to the infringement of his interest in freedom of association and movement. Second, because this is a protest, a kind of book definition of protest. And one of the things that is very clear in political theory is that protests are the kind of actions that we take up by our political institutions have to take protests up. They have to consider them, which does not mean these protests have to be obeyed, all protests. It's not that. What it means is that it has to be part of political processes, and it has to be listened to, attended to, and it has to influence policymaking at the very least. Sometimes it might involve simply not agreeing with this, and if Ozzy is going to be a danger for other animals, perhaps it is good that he initially doesn't go to the back pasture. But perhaps the way to respond to this would be to create ways. The policymakers would need to find ways for Ozzy to be able to socialize with others, to live in community, because he's really asking to go back, right? So the second reason is protest. And the third one is that if taken up, Ozzy's actions can serve as a check to arbitrary power. So we humans have power to, right now, to put animals wherever we want, to decide where they live, where they roam, with whom they associate. At the heart of a democracy is liberty, the right to freedom. And I think he is saying to us here, I also have an interest in being free and making my own decisions. And these decisions need to be listened to, of course. So I hope that at least this gives us some reasons, at least, of why this is the kind of action that should be taken up by our political institutions. These are some of the reasons, I think, that justify that some of the things that animals do, some of the things that they say through their bodies and phonetic utterances should be taken up by our political institutions, because the aim is to build more just democratic systems. And by listening to this kind of animals saying these kinds of things, I think we can build a more just system. And ignoring this would lead to the opposite, to just a tyranny, as Donaldson and Kimlicka argue, or at least so I think that. But let me know if you found convincing this or not. This is open to debate. We have not settled these questions up at all. So yeah, thank you so much for listening.